all I once held dear, build my life upon all this world reveals, and was to own all I once thought gain. I have counted loss, spent and worthless now, compared to this, knowing you, Jesus, knowing you, there is no greater thing. You're my all, you're the best, you're my joy, my righteousness, and I love you, Lord. Now my heart's desire is to know you more, to be found in you, and known as yours, to possess by faith what I could not earn, all surpassing gift of righteousness, knowing you, Jesus, knowing you, there is no greater thing. You're my all, you're the best, you're my joy, my righteousness, and I love you, Lord. Oh, to know the power of your risen light, and to know you in your sufferings, to become like you in your death, oh Lord, so with you to live and never die, knowing you, Jesus, knowing you, there is no greater thing. You're my all, you're the best, you're my joy, my righteousness, and I love you, Lord, and I love you, Lord.
All right. Hey, good morning, everybody. It is Thursday morning, September the 7th, 2023, and we're going to continue through Paul's letter to the congregation at Philippi. And let's pick up, let's reread, beginning in Philippians 3, chapter 1. The title today is One Thing to Know Him. One Thing to Know Him. Paul writes this, finally, or the remaining, he says, my brothers and sisters, Rejoice in the Lord. To keep writing the same things to you is not troublesome for me, but for you it's a safeguard. It's to keep you, the language here again, to keep you from stumbling, from falling. Beware of the dogs. Watch out for the dogs. Beware of the evil workers. Beware of the mutilation. For it's we who are the circumcision, who worship by the Ruach Elohim, who worship by the Spirit of God and glory in Messiah Yeshua, and have not depended on the flesh. So again, he says, I want you to watch out for those that are going to come and make you feel like something that you've got to do, and they're going to reduce who you are in the Lord to these external things. He says that he's going to talk about as basically depending on the flesh. He says we are the true, those who truly are set apart to God, the true ones that have been cut away to God, are those who are characterized in three ways. He says we're a people who worship by the Spirit of God, who live by the Spirit, of God, who are living out the pattern, the mind of Messiah. He says we're a people who are glorying, who are to glory in Messiah Yeshua, to put our confidence, we find our confidence in him, and our confidence is not on the flesh. He says if someone wants to make an argument for all that they do as a source of righteousness, I can make that argument. He says, though I myself might have confidence in the flesh also. If anyone else thinks he might depend on the flesh, I far more. Circumcised the 8th day, of the nation of Israel, from the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of Hebrews. In regard to the Torah, a Pharisee. And then within being a Pharisee, he says, as for zeal, I was persecuting Messiah's community. As for righteousness according to the law, he says, as for Torah righteousness or righteousness according to the law, found blameless. And again, when we read that found blameless, it can sound like, he's saying somehow that he was perfectly righteous in his standing before God. But what Paul's referring to is first of all, with righteousness according to the law, this sort of Torah observance understood as observable conduct. And Paul says, I have no blemishes on my record as far as that kind of observance, what you can see. I'm scrupulously adhering to the regulations for Sabbath observance and the food laws and ritual cleanliness and so forth. It's not about his being righteous before the Lord in that case. And he says in regard to that, faultless. And you would think that so if that's the case for him, there's no benefit in him if it's something that somehow he's making up. There's no benefit in him preaching a righteousness by faith versus a righteousness by works. He says, look, I could, we want to talk about depending on the flesh, I have a really great resume. But see, now, what we talked about yesterday, he's met the Master, he's encountered the Lord, and he sees basically what he has done is, what Paul has done, all of these works are, it's like painting by numbers art. It's not something that you're to put out for display. He has seen who the Lord is, and so now in the following verses, he's patterning his life after the mind of Messiah, and again it almost echoes kind of chapter 2 where you look at where Yeshua goes from a place of being exalted, being at the who being in very nature God, in this place of privilege, humbles himself, comes to the place of death, even death on a cross, and then following that to exaltation. And so Paul here says, I'm coming from here, I consider it all loss, right? I'm dying to this so that I might somehow attain the resurrection from the dead. He says, and here when Paul is talking about we are the true circumcision, we who worship by the Spirit of God, right? We who live by the Spirit of God, understanding who put our confidence in Messiah, don't put our confidence in the flesh. But his focus, even in living by the Spirit of God, and what he's going to come to is he's going to now talk about righteousness. His focus is not about initially the outward right living as as the focus. The focus is on the basis, the predicate, the foundation for such living, right? But because our righteous living is, we're worshiping, living by the Spirit of God. That living is an overflow of knowing Him. He says, whatever, verse 7, whatever things were gain to me, all the things that were profit to me, these I regard them as loss for the sake of Messiah. And he says, truly, but really, more than that, I consider all things to be loss in comparison to the surpassing value of the knowledge of Messiah Yeshua, my Lord. Compared to knowing Him, it doesn't even compare. He says, because of Him, I have suffered the loss of all things. And he's not complaining about it. He says, I have forfeited all things. You could say suffered the loss, but I have lost all things. I have forfeited everything, he says. And I consider them garbage. I consider them rubbish. I consider them dung. In order that I might gain Messiah. I want to know Him. He goes, and be found in Him. I want to be found in Him, not having a righteousness derived from the law, from Torah, but one that is through trusting in Messiah. The righteousness from God based on trust. In verse 10, so literally kind of the flow into verse 10, which is the righteousness that is out of God or from God, surrounding that which is by faith, of that which is to know Him. A righteousness that is of knowing Him, from the fact of knowing Him and the power of His resurrection and the sharing of His sufferings, becoming like Him in His death. And somehow to attain the resurrection from the dead. But first he says here, I want to know Him. And he says, I want to know Him fully, right? I want to know Him in the power of His resurrection. I want to know Him in the fellowship, in the koinonia of sharing in His suffering. Right? That's the foundation of the way that I'm going to live my life. I want a righteousness of being found in Him. And he begins to talk about, when you boil everything down, what can happen is when we get focused in on a legalistic righteousness, kind of checkbox spirituality, we can get distracted in what are we in pursuit of? Are we simply in pursuit of what's of getting a passing grade? I just want to get into heaven. That's all I care about. Is our pursuit still a selfish one? Or is our pursuit that we have actually encountered Him and we have seen who He is and we want to know Him more and we want to know Him fully? We want to know Him in totality. I want to be like the one who is Lord of all. I want to be like the one who in very nature God didn't consider equality with God something to be grasped. He didn't live a life of grasping and taking for Himself, but He lived a life of pouring out. Right? He humbled Himself. He took on the very nature of a servant, and He humbled Himself, becoming obedient unto death, even death on a cross. I want to know Him. I want to fully identify with Him. I think as he says, first he says, I want to know Him in the power of His resurrection. And he uses the word dunamis. We would get the word dynamite, but it has to do with dunamis in Greek, has to do with the ability, that capability. Power in that regard is that ability. I want the power, the capability, so to speak, of His resurrection, right? That resurrection power that's at work within me. transforming me from death to life. In this regard, in this portion, now in verse 11, he's speaking more to the physical resurrection. But here I want to know him in the power of his resurrection. You get a better sense of what he's talking about when you can see it even expressed in other writings of Paul. So, for instance, even though he doesn't talk about resurrection here, Paul, you see the idea of resurrection in conjunction with suffering, and so at times crucifixion, but suffering. That the resurrection followed the crucifixion. To get to the resurrection, there had to be a death. Right? So in 2 Corinthians 4, verses 6 through 10, he says, "For God, who said, 'Let light shine out of darkness,' is the one who has shown in our hearts to give light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Messiah." This picture of that he is transforming me, that there's a shining, there's a transformation happening within. And so now what's in, he says, we have this treasure, this light, this knowledge, the glory of God from the face of Messiah, from knowing him. We have this treasure in jars of clay. So that we're just jars of clay, but what's in us is beyond. It's this priceless treasure. So that the surpassing greatness of the power may be from God, not from ourselves. We are hard pressed in every way, but not crushed. Perplexed, yet not in despair. Persecuted, yet not forsaken. Struck down, yet not destroyed. Always carrying in the body the death of Yeshua, so that the life of Yeshua may also be revealed in our mortal body. I want to know him in the power of his resurrection, in the power of being dead to self, in the power of his resurrected life. In Romans chapter 6, a passage we're quite familiar with, especially in regard to when we're immersed in water. He says, "Therefore we were buried together with him through immersion into death, in order that just as Messiah was raised from the dead by the glory of the Father, so we too might walk in newness of life." So the walking in the power of his resurrection is like walking in that newness of life. When we face, let me read. "For if we have become joined together in the likeness of his death, certainly we will also be joined together in his resurrection. Knowing our old man was crucified with him so that the sinful body might be done away with, so we no longer serve sin. For he who has died is set free from sin." I'm dead to self. I no longer am dominated by me firstness. That's the goal. I want to know him like that. I want that kind of spiritual transformation, so that I'm knowing him moment by moment from glory to glory. And 2 Corinthians 3 says, whenever someone turns to the Lord, verse 16, he says, the veil is taken away. Now the Lord is the Spirit, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, there's freedom. But we all, with unveiled face, beholding as in a mirror the glory of the Lord, are being transformed into the same image from glory to glory, just as from the Lord who is the Spirit. There is a transformation. That's what he says I'm in. I want to know him fully. I want to know him in the power of his resurrection. I want to be raised to new life within. But again, for there to be a resurrection, there had to be a crucifixion. I don't get to live for self, to hold on, to cling to my sinful nature, to cling to it, to not die to it. And then somehow say, but I want to know him only in the power of his resurrection. I want to know him in the power of his resurrection. I need to know him in the partaking, in the koinonia of his suffering, the sharing of his suffering, becoming like him in his death. Again, Yeshua said in Matthew 16:24, "If anyone would come after me, he must deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me." He says, I want to know him fully. Whenever we face moments that squeeze us, usually when we feel pressed, and perplexed and crushed, and all the things that he was describing there in 2 Corinthians, we pray things like, God, get me out of this, get me through this. But the pursuit is in the midst of this. This is an opportunity. This is an opportunity for me to be formed into your likeness, to share in the in the koinonia, the fellowship of sharing in suffering. And this isn't suffering compared. You, Lord, died while we were still sinners, when we were, for the very ones who were persecuting you, you died. It was completely unfair. Here we're willing to love until someone's unloving to us. We're willing to be Yeshua-like until it costs us something. Until, well, I can't do that. And what he calls us to, and what you see Paul in pursuit of here, is saying, I want to know him. This is not about checking off boxes. It's not about being able to, it's not about the empty pursuit of glory. Look at all I have. I'm of the, a son of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of Hebrews in regard. I'm a Pharisee and faultless and persecuting the church, zealous. He doesn't look at my trophy case. It's like, you can trash that. None of that matters compared to that's not going to produce anything in me. That's not going to transform me. That's not going to change me. What I want to do is I want to know him. The transformation, that living the life of the Spirit of God, right? That transformation happens from knowing him. Knowing him in the power and that what he's doing within me, raising me to new life, to newness of life. I don't want to check off boxes. I want to be like him, not just look like him. I want to, as I grow into his likeness, I want to come to a place where when the pressure squeezes, that my most natural inclination is less of Cosmo and more like Yeshua. That my instinctive response is to see through his eyes, right? And to do that, and it's not about feeding my flesh, or it's about not depending on my flesh. It's about sharing in the fellowship of his sufferings, knowing him fully, walking as he walked. That's Peter and John, both in their epistles, talk to us. If he did this, then we ought to as well. We need to walk like him. He goes on in verse 11 here. He says, so I want to know him in the power of his resurrection, the fellowship of his sufferings, becoming like him in his death. Verse 11, if somehow I might arrive at the resurrection from among the dead. Now here, because he says resurrection from among the dead, and he uses the word nekron for dead, he is speaking of a physical resurrection. He's looking forward to the physical resurrection, not just because he's interested in a new body, sure, but the resurrection, right, represents the completion, when everything is done. It's the totality at every level of my existence, when I have been completely made new, right? It's the culmination of this journey when I am made new in every way. Because I am made new. You and I are a new creation, and yet we still have this old body. But we are children of God, right? And you see this longing expressed in Romans chapter 8. He says, first of all, verse 16, the Spirit himself bears witness with our spirit that we're children of God. And if we're children, we're also heirs of God, joint heirs with Messiah, if indeed we suffer with him, so that we may also be glorified with him. The suffering and the glory, you don't get one without the other, right? It says he humbled himself, becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. Therefore, God exalted him to the highest place, that at the name of Yeshua every knee should bow and every tongue will confess. That the suffering was followed by the glorification. He says, if we suffer with him, we may also be glorified with him. And I consider, verse 18, the sufferings of this present time not worthy to be compared with the coming glory to be revealed to us. Creation eagerly awaits the revealing of the children of God, it says, the sons of God. Now, when we read this here in verse 11, look again at verse 11. He says, if somehow, it says epos, which is if I might arrive at the resurrection from the dead. At first glance, for some, they read it and it raises kind of a problem, because there seems to be a tentativeness in Paul's language, right? If somehow I might reach resurrection from the dead. And the reason it's a problem is because elsewhere, usually Paul speaks with great confidence, the assurance about his future hope, right? So how does this work? But it's not a problem when we look at total context, because first of all, it's not uncertainty. There's simply a resurrection that I'm not there yet, and I still have to walk this out. Hey, Philippians, you're not there yet. You still got to walk this out. We'll see when you look in other writings, when you read in Paul's pastoral epistles, when you read in 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, Paul speaks with heartbreak at moments about those whose faith has been shipwrecked, those who have not endured, those who have not persevered. And so he's not walking with a tentativeness, but there is a humility expressed here, right? Because it's always important that we distinguish between, first of all, there's an unmovable, our hope is unmovable. God is, what he has done is firm and is sure. Our apprehension of that, our attaining to where we have to finish what was started. This is what the writer of Hebrews is talking about in Hebrews chapter 4, when he says, Hebrews chapters 3 and 4, and when he's like, our fathers were saved out of Egypt, and they were being brought to the promised land, but they stopped trusting, and they died in the desert. They didn't reach the goal. Don't turn back now. Don't begin to step away. Don't begin to turn away, because if you fall away, it says it's almost impossible to come back from that. That's what the writer of Hebrews says, right? So what Paul's expressing here is with a humility that's not supposed to create an anxiety, but a determination. And you'll see his determination in the following verses. He is, in spite of his maturity and writing under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, Paul is not sinless, and he's not omniscient. So he says, if somehow I might attain, like I'm waiting and I'm in pursuit. And look, it's not the only passage where there's this kind of humble expression of distrust of self. That back in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, he writes, don't you know that in a stadium the runners all run, but one receives the prize? Run in such a way that you may win. Every competitor exercises self-control in all respects. They do it to receive a perishable crown, but we do it to receive an imperishable one. So I run in this way, not aimlessly. So I box in this way, not beating the air. Rather, I punish my body and bring it into submission. Right? I don't just feed my flesh. I bring it into submission so that after I have preached to others, I myself will not be disqualified. And that disqualified it's a word that is dokimos, which the dokimos means to be approved, to pass the test, to come through the fire and endure the fire. I don't want to not endure and not pass the test, not be approved or be disqualified. It's the same language that he used in the first chapter where he says, now, Philippians 1:9, This I pray, that your love might overflow still more and more in knowledge and depth of discernment, in order to approve to what is excellent, so that in the day of Messiah you may be sincere and blameless, right? Filled with the fruit of righteousness that comes through Yeshua the Messiah, to the glory and praise of God. So Paul himself says, I don't want to preach to others and then myself not pass the test. Right? So there's a recognition that he has. There's a humility that I've got to do my part with all that he's done for me. I want to know him. I want to know him fully. I want to know him in the power of his resurrection. I want to know him in the fellowship of sharing in his sufferings, becoming like him in his death, so somehow I might attain the resurrection. And then he goes on verse 12. It says, not that I have already obtained this or been made perfect, but I press on, if only I may take hold of that for which Messiah Yeshua took hold of me. Now, years ago, one of the first class I ever took where I studied Greek when I was in college, I had to pick a passage to write a paper on. So this was the passage, this section of Scripture. And so I began studying this passage, and I noticed that where it says, not that I have already obtained this, this is the direct object. Obtained what? This. But it doesn't actually say, there's no direct object. So literally, here's what how the verse reads in Greek. It says, not that I have obtained or have been made perfect, made complete, telomai. It has to do with having reached the goal, having been made complete or fully mature. I haven't reached the goal. He says, but I'm in pursuit. I press on. I'm pursuing. If also I might take hold, in as much as I was taken hold of by Messiah Yeshua. He says, not that I have obtained or have been made complete, but I press on to take hold of, to take hold of in as much as I was taken hold of by Messiah Yeshua. Right? And not that I have obtained what? A lot of times people say, well, he's talking about the resurrection. Not that I obtained the resurrection of the dead. They're drawing that conclusion based on verse 11, somehow I might attain the resurrection from the dead. But, of course, he hasn't died yet. So it's not about that he hasn't attained the resurrection from the dead. His goal, what's his aim? What's his expressed aim? I want to be found in him. I want to be found in him, not having a righteousness of my own, but a righteousness that is based on faith in Yeshua, of knowing him. I want to know him and the power of his resurrection, the fellowship of sharing in his sufferings. Not that I have obtained this knowing, this totality in knowing, right? Not that I have reached the goal where I am like, I know him completely, I know him fully. I'm still in pursuit. Paul says, I'm in pursuit. I'm not been made complete. I want to take hold of in as much as I was taken hold of. He took hold of me, and he wrapped his arms around me, and I want to wrap my arms around him. I want to take hold of him in totality. He took hold of me in totality, all of me, and I want all of him, the fellowship of the power of his resurrection, the fellowship of sharing of his sufferings. I want to know him completely. He goes on in verse 13, brothers and sisters, I don't consider myself to have taken hold. I don't consider myself, count myself to have taken hold of. He says, but then it goes, it says, but one. Literally, it's but one. But one thing. I mean, it's two tiny little words that have like a power punch. But one. But one, he says, forgetting what is behind. He says, on the one hand, that which is behind, forgetting those things. What's he talking about? He's talking about all the good things and the bad things, right? All the trophies, all the stuff that's refuse, including the persecuting. He's leaving that behind. He's not going to walk in beating himself up forever over that. He knows that God's grace is sufficient for him, that God's power is made perfect in his weakness. Forgetting what is behind, leaving it behind, and stretching, straining toward what is ahead. There's this imagery, this athletic imagery, right, of him, of a runner whose every muscle is straining and singularly focused. One thing, not focused on all the stuff. That's behind me. He's not looking to the left or the right. I want to know him. I haven't been made complete in my knowledge of him. But one thing I do, forgetting everything else and straining toward him, I am in single-minded pursuit of Messiah Yeshua. In reality, in totality, not in some cartoonish version of him, not in some twisted up version that leaves out the suffering, that leaves out the discomfort, that says, oh, you can have everything you want. The gospel is about health, wealth, and prosperity, and doesn't preach about dying to self. If anyone would come after me, he must deny self. If you cling to your life, you'll lose it, but if you'll lose your life for my sake, you'll find it. One thing, I want to know him in totality. Right? I love just the heart and the passion and the humility of Paul expressed here. He is forgetting what is behind, straining toward what is ahead. He says, I'm aiming for the target, for the goal. Verse 13, I press on toward the goal. He goes, toward the goal, I'm in pursuit. For the reward of the upward calling of God in Messiah Yeshua. That one thing, I want to know him. It's not about all that other stuff. It's not about what I can tell people, well, I do this and we do that. He says it's all rubbish. If that's what you're leaning on, if that's what you're depending on. But if I know him in the power of his resurrection and the fellowship of his sharing in his sufferings, then suddenly, and I'm walking in his way, then I'm doing nothing out of selfish ambition, because that's what he did. Then I'm considering others before myself. I'm not doing something in pursuit of vainglory so others will give me trophies and applause and recognition. That's not what I'm in pursuit of. It's not about me being known. It's about I want to know him. That's my goal. That's my aim. That's my pursuit. One thing, to know him. And the overflow of that knowing him is the resurrected life, is a life of newness, is now we're living, worshiping by the Spirit of God, is the Spirit of God dwelling within, and the fruit of the Spirit, the fruit of righteousness coming from our lives. The overflow, when the predicate, when the basis, when the foundation is, I know him, and he walks with me, and he talks with me, and he tells me I am his own. Then when I know him, that the overflow of my life in an ever-increasing way is that I would look more and more like him. Right? That's what I want. If I aim at the externals, I won't find him. But if I aim for him, all the externals they'll overflow. Seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness. He'll take care of all. I want to know him. And then he says there, verse 15 says, therefore let all who are, we'll go through this, let all who are mature, who are complete, or who are at the goal, let them have this mind. If you have a different mindset, if you have a different attitude in anything, this also, he says, God will unveil to you, will reveal to you. He'll open your eyes to see it. This is what so you think you're mature, you think you've reached the goal, you think you've accomplished it. Here Paul, who has this resume, says, I haven't. Not that I have. But all of you who think you're mature, it's almost some irony in here, because it's all who are teleo, all who are perfect, all who are complete, all who are goal. I want you to have this mind, because that'll deal with it, right? If your pursuit is to know him and the power of his resurrection, the fellowship of sharing in his sufferings, becoming like in his death so as to somehow attain the resurrection of the dead, I want to know him, to be in that single-minded pursuit. Then if we aim that, then all this other stuff will be considered as refuse and skubala, garbage, right? All right, well, let me say good morning to everybody. And all right, yeah, that's okay. All right, well, hey, good morning to. It's a busy Thursday. Good morning to Joshua, and good morning to Phyllis and to Jackie. And let's see here, and I gotta close that. And good morning to Barbara, and to Pastor and Sister Martinez. And good morning to the Eddies, to Lauren and Mike and David and Levi and Valor and Haven and Everett, to Kathleen, to Kelly Kenfield, and to Kelly and Melody Woods, and to Richard and Ellen and Elizabeth and Jesse, and to the Eddies, to Lauren and Mike and David and Levi and Valor and Haven and Everett. I think I said hello to them already, didn't I? I don't remember. Did I not? I got confused. I thought it, but didn't say it. Good morning to Pat and Lori, and to Ron and Amy, and to Sonia, to Koch, and to Sonia and Margarita, and good morning to Jerry and Janet and Dayspring and Rachel and Joyce and Joe and Jason, and hello, good afternoon to my sister Maria. I love you. I hope you're doing well. Let's pursue him and say, in every circumstance, in the difficulties, I'm not asking you to do away with the difficulties. I'm asking you to transform me in the midst of the difficulties. I want to know you in the difficulties. I want to know you in the pain. I want to know you in the suffering. I want in those moments when I'm squeezed, that what comes out of me looks more and more like Yeshua. That's what I want. I want to know you in the fellowship of your in the power of the resurrected life, in the fellowship of your sufferings, to partake in that with you, to become like you in totality. Amen. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious unto you. May the Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. Shalom, shalom. Have a beautiful day.
All I once held dear, build my life upon. All this world reveals, and was to own. All I once thought gain, I have counted loss, spent and worthless now, compared to this, knowing you, Jesus, knowing you, there is no greater thing. You're my all, you're the best, you're my joy, my righteousness, and I love you, Lord. Now my heart's desire is to know you more, to be found in you, and known as yours, to possess by faith what I could not earn, all surpassing gift of righteousness, knowing you, Jesus, knowing you, there is no greater thing. You're my all, you're the best, you're my joy, my righteousness, and I love you, Lord. Oh, to know the power of your risen and to know you in your suffering, to become like you in your death, oh Lord, so with you to live and never die, knowing you, Jesus, knowing you, there is no greater thing. You're my all, you're the best, you're my joy, my righteousness.